So last week we started talking about the return of Jesus, and we just kind of had sort of a big picture general discussion and looked at some of the key principles of some of the things we know about Jesus' return. And I mentioned last week we would kind of use Matthew chapters 24 and 25 as sort of our touching point on this subject, because there's a lot of things in the Bible that talk about it, and we can look at a lot of different issues. I know last week, I think it was Jason that made a comment from a reference to Zechariah where it talks about the Jerusalem being split and things like that. And I don't even know if we're going to have time to get into that kind of detail. We're probably going to really focus on some high-level things from a first principle perspective. But we use Matthew chapter 24. So actually, if you want to turn to Matthew 24 as a start. And this morning, we're just going to focus on the theme of the suddenness of Jesus' return. Again, last week looked at, there's a lot of things that we asked people, what are some things we know about Jesus' return? And one of the key themes that comes up over and over again in both here in Matthew and other places is just how sudden and unexpected his return will be. And that's something that we're reminded of over and over again. And so looking at Matthew chapter 24, we're going to start about verse 36. Kind of work our way down to the end of the chapter. Verse 36 is where Jesus tells his disciples, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only." And of course, the day and hour that Jesus is referring to is the coming of the Son of Man. That was a few passages back. And what Jesus says is that the day and hour no one knows. Now, I've heard brothers and people outside our community who try to, predict when Jesus is going to come back. And so they read that passage and they say, well, Jesus says we don't know the day or the hour. It doesn't say anything about the year. And so over the years, people have tried to, use Daniel and calculate the return of Jesus. But there's been one consistent theme in all those predictions. Always been wrong, right? and I think that, I would argue that, I don't think that Jesus is trying to be super specific here in his wording and try to leave open the door that you can maybe guess the year. I think he's just saying you just don't know, period. It's going to be sudden. And in fact, one of the things about good Bible study is reading the context. And if you read the rest of this chapter, you start here in verse 36, it says the day and hour no one knows. Verse 39, really verses 36 to 39, he talks about that suddenness again, using the flood during the days of Noah. And then verse 42, he says, "Watch therefore, for you do not know the hour your Lord is coming." Verse 43, it says it's going to be like a thief in the night. Verse 44, it says it's going to come in an hour you do not expect. Verse 50, it says the master will come at a time he is not expecting. Again, the context of that is about a master who leaves his servant in charge of his household. He's going to come at a time you won't expect. Then chapter 25, verse 13, after the parable of the bridegrooms, it says, "Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man is coming." So that's kind of a theme that this passage starts us in, is like passage after passage, it's going to be a surprise. And Jesus uses several object lessons and parables, I guess you could say, to help us understand that and really understand the importance for us to be alert and always be ready, because we really don't know when he's coming. And so anyway, so that's kind of what our focus will be this morning. We're going to start off by looking at the first allusion that Jesus talks about. It talks about the days of Noah. And if we could read that section there, verses 36 to 42 of Matthew chapter 24. So Matthew 24, verses 36 to 42. Maybe Brian kind of work our way around, if that's all right.
How many verses we do?
36 to verse 42.
Whole thing then. "But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming.
All right, thank you for reading that. So the first illustration that Jesus uses, he references back to the days of Noah. So we'll just kind of maybe start off with that broad question. What was it like in the days of Noah? What were times like, and why is Jesus using that as a reference? Yeah, Casey.
I think what it's saying is life will just be like normal. They didn't describe anything bad in here. This is just normal day-to-day life that's occurring. Nothing unusual is happening. And I think, so we had that one perspective where, well, it's just like, everyday normal life. But then we also sometimes get in our minds back in verse 22 that if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. And so I think we also have in our minds sometimes that the world is just going to be a complete disaster when Jesus comes back. But I think verse 22 is describing 70 AD. But verses 36, 37, that's describing Jesus' return. So there's not going to be anything out of the ordinary happening. The world isn't going to have fallen apart before Jesus returns.
Yeah, and I think we talked about that last week. That's one of the struggles in reading the Olivet prophecy, is that Jesus is answering 2 questions. When is the destruction of all these buildings, Jerusalem, going to be? And when is the day of your coming? And so you're right, yeah, that's, and I know there's debate on that, but I would agree with you. I think that verse 22 is talking about that time period around AD 70 when the Romans came in. And if you read Josephus, the Jewish historian at that time, it's just a horrible, just hard to read just how bad things were. And so you can kind of understand why Jesus said those days were shortened. So, yeah.
I was going to say that, I agree with what Casey was saying as far as that this world is going to be about their normal business, and they're going to have a clue that Jesus is returning. But I also think it probably relates to the days of Noah as well, because in Genesis it describes, it says the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And so this was a time of ungodliness, a time of violence, a time, it was just it was so evil that God looked upon that and said, we just need to get rid of this.
That's Genesis 6 that you're reading from, right?
Yeah.
Where it talks about, and you're right, it talks about immorality and violence. And on the one hand, that you can look around today and say, that really fits the world we live in. But then again, people 50 years ago could also talk about, but yeah, it's...
Morality is really, it's gotten to the point, it's just disgusting at this point in time. It's just, I think we've reached an all-time low in the last 100 years.
I think I agree with both David and Casey, and I think to Casey's point that, there were things that were basically normal that were going on or considered to become normal, but it was the people were consumed with serving themselves, and certainly that's a parallel to today. And somebody once told me as well that violence is the height of selfishness, because it's either one person or one nation saying, I'm right and you're wrong, and I'm going to go to the point of imposing my will on you physically to prove that, and feeling completely justified in doing that. And so violence is just the epitome of self-centeredness and selfishness. And I just thought that was an interesting way to look at it.
And I agree with what everyone said as well. I also think Jesus is using the example of Noah because when you look at the significance of both events, the flood was probably the biggest world event to have ever happened before the return of Jesus will happen, right? Because the whole world was wiped out, and Jesus is gonna essentially wipe out the governments of men, essentially, and it'll be obviously a big event as well. So I never really noticed that correlation until now, that this is going to be kind of like the flood, and that it's going to be that big of a worldwide event, not just isolated to a certain locale.
I think Walter has a comment.
I'm going to put a little different twist on it. I think the phraseology here in verse 38 is talking about the frequency. It's a little bit what John said about being consumed. I think it's the frequency of eating and drinking, and that's what we have today, is all kinds of causes for festivities and drinking, particularly alcohol. And then marrying and giving in marriage can mean the frequency of marriage. It's not man and woman for life, it's man and woman for 5 years, and we'll get another one, and another 5 years, we'll get a third one. I think that's kind of what he's describing here.
Yeah, they did a good job of summing up what I was originally going to say, but I find it interesting that Genesis 6:5 and 6:6 form a kind of platform, if you will, God's justification to us about what he's going to do. He said, God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination or thought of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And Christ is trying to invoke in our minds a sense of that's how the land was, and God destroyed them utterly from the face of the earth. And he wanted to warn them and say, this is the same kind of thing that's coming in the future, but just in a different form. Christ repeats it here, and then even in the book of Revelation, you get this very same sense that for the evil and you're turning your back on God, he's going to make all these decisions and destroy things. So this is really a call for us to pay attention, be watching, and make sure we're not in this category with everybody else that's here. And also online, we had a message. It says, the flood was predicted for 900 years plus years. Methuselah named me his death shall bring. Same today, people are saying, where is his coming?
Thank you for those in, yeah. And that was kind of I think a lot of the comments that were made were sort of the takeaway that I took as well, that, you read about these things and they're not explicitly like horrible bad things on the surface, eating and drinking and marrying, but there's other passages we can look at where it shows that people became so absorbed into those activities that it took away their focus from doing God's work. One good parallel passage, I think, is in Luke. We'll turn over to Luke chapter 14. And we could read Luke chapter 14 and then verses maybe 16 to 20.
14, 16 through 20. But he said to him, a man once gave a great banquet and invited many. And at the time for the banquet, he sent his servant to say to those who have been invited, come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, I have bought a field and I must go out and see it. Please have me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen and I go to examine them. Please have me excused. Another said, I have married a wife and therefore I cannot come.
So this is the parable of this banquet. The guy's sending out all these invitations, and everyone's saying, I can't come because I've got oxen, I just got a piece of land, I've got married. And again, none of those things are really sinful in themselves, right? But when they become more important than God's ways, and when the mundane things of life kind of consume us, I think that's what Jesus is warning us against here, is that here are these guys that are getting invited to this banquet, but they're saying, well, my life is too busy. I can't do that right now. When I hear in Matthew's gospel, when he talks about, eating and drinking, marrying, giving marriage, I just kind of see this as maybe like a parallel sort of teaching here is that I think like what people said is like this is be people are so consumed with day-to-day life, they're not going to be ready for when Jesus comes back. There is another cross-reference. If you want to turn over to Luke chapter 21, verse 34. And so we could read Luke 21, verse 34.
Just 34, okay. But take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the cares of this life, and that day come on you unexpectedly.
And, maybe the first couple things, carousing and drunkenness, are problems, but then it says the cares of this life, and I think, again, that's a challenge for us as well. And then maybe one more cross-reference, Matthew chapter 13, verse 22.
(13:22), the seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful.
So again, this is the parable of the sower, and it's talking about these different types of soil, and there are those that were planted. It talks about the thorns that sort of choke the fruit. It says those thorns, those are the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches. So again, I just see those, at least for me, I think those are kind of parallel with what Jesus is saying back in the Olivet prophecy. Is just the things of this world become so important that when he comes back, people aren't ready. They aren't doing God's work. Yeah.
Just one thing I was thinking, going back to what it says about the times of Noah, and one thing it says about them that we hear all the time these days is it says everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And that is something that we hear a lot these days, that as long as you're not hurting anybody, you can do whatever you want. It doesn't matter, you know. And we know that that is not true, and that is actually a very dangerous way of thinking.
And somebody else made a comment, I think one of the online comments, about how this was, it really shouldn't have taken them unaware when the flood came. In 2 Peter chapter 5, it describes Noah. It says, if you want to look there real quick, I didn't write the verse down, but it's 2 Peter 5. And, oops, maybe it's, is it 3 verse, chapter 3? It's the one where it says Noah was a preacher of righteousness. That was the one I intended to write down. Is it 1 Peter 3? It's in Peter somewhere. Chapter 2, verse 5. Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so Second Peter chapter 2 goes through a lot of things at the end times, but in verse 5 it says he did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing flood on the world of the ungodly. So, someone made that comment, but it's Jesus talks about how it came suddenly and unaware, but really it was only sudden and unaware because they didn't listen. Again, we're kind of filling in some blanks here, that it seems like maybe Noah was perhaps trying to reach out to people during those years when he was building the ark and trying to turn them away from what's going to happen. But anyway, just some interesting connections there. The other big thing that comes in at the end is it talks about, in the King James it says keeping watch in verse 42, or keeping awake in other versions. And we see that in other places in Scripture, this kind of admonition to be careful against, falling asleep. It's this illusion of someone who's like watching for like standing guard, and you don't want to fall asleep. You need to keep awake. Paul really picks up on that in Thessalonians. We'll just look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 real quick. He really, he talks about the end times, but that's kind of his message to those who were in Thessalonica, that they needed to keep awake and keep watch. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And if we could just read verses 1 through 6.
But of the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write to you. For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say, peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that that day should overtake you as a thief. You are all the children of light and the children of the day. We are not of the night, nor of darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep as do others, but let us watch and be sober.
Thank you. So, Paul, talking about that time period, uses some of the same kind of ideas that Jesus does, doesn't he? He talks about it, that they would be like a thief in the night. His exhortation against them is not to fall asleep, but to stay, and some versions say keep watch and be sober, but be awake. But that's kind of the idea. It says there's going to be peace and safety and then sudden destruction. So again, there's this idea of people sort of life as usual, and then suddenly things will change very rapidly, and they'll be caught unaware. And so again, there's the exhortation for believers is always, it's not trying to find out when Jesus is coming back, just knowing it could be any time, and we really should just be living our lives consistently.
Yeah, and yeah, I think the point is to, what does it mean to wait and to watch, right? Is it like looking out the window all the time, or is it living your life in the manner that God would have you to live it, right? Walking in the light so that there's never really darkness, right? So you can use that light and darkness analogy. So it's not, it can almost, if you read it wrong, it can almost make you feel like you should be nervous all the time and watching and be careful, he's coming, watch out, but it's really, how do you live your life, and are you, walking in the light, or tempted to walk in the light, right?
Thank you, Casey.
To me, this deceitfulness of riches and what that does to our minds, I think, is the real exhortation for us today, more than any time through history. We all here in this room spend money every day on things we don't need to spend it on. We save up because there's this thing called retirement that gets longer and longer as we live longer and longer. And it's hard, really hard, to balance practicalities and true needs against wants and worries and lack of faith. Are we supposed to just say, well, okay, I believe God's going to take care of me, and so I'm not going to save, I'm not going to do these, it's just really hard to balance it all out. And we can either feel justified or we can feel guilty. We all want to do the right thing and have our heads in the right places. But in practical terms, speaking for myself, I'm a huge failure on this front. I see it staring me right in the eyes, and I can't do what I can't mimic Jesus. I don't know that it's practical to mimic Jesus. I don't know, it's just a really hard subject for me.
One of the things I really love about this passage, it's sometimes easy to miss, is there are two things he talked about. This, being at watch, I'm looking for something. But then this state of mind where he says, be sober. That is, don't have your mind clouded. Don't have it distracted by things. Because I can be watching like many people do for the coming of Christ, but in a way that is totally not in keeping what he's telling you about. They're waiting to be taken off to someplace else other than he tells them. And I think it's beautiful the way he sums up this passage when he says, but let us who are of the day, those who are in the light, in other words, be sober, in other words, clear-minded, putting on the breastplate of faith and love. That is, that faith that covers the heart so you're protected against this way of living. And for a helmet, the hope of salvation, because the helmet protects the mind. And so he's saying, dwell on the things about salvation, the things that have this same love we talked about earlier today.
Right, so it's interesting, in Matthew's account, he talks about Noah. If you look over in Luke's account, he actually gives another example of historical. In Luke chapter 17, he mentions Noah, but he also mentions Lot. Luke chapter 17, verses 28 to 33.
Like, just as it was written, just as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planning and building. And on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. So will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, let one who is on the housetop with his goods in the house not come down to take them away. Likewise, let the one who is in the field not turn back. Remember Lot's wife.
So, that other passage, Jesus talks about not just Noah, but he talks about Lot. And really kind of a similar message. He says that in the days of Sodom, they sold, they planted, they built, they ate, they drank, and against this idea of just life was going on. And again, you ask the question, what was it like in the days of Lot, particularly where he was living in Sodom and Gomorrah? And again, you can look back in Genesis, and it kind of describes that time period. Genesis chapter 13.
Yeah, one comment on this is that both in Noah's day and in Lot's day, and I mean, one of the things you see when Abraham tries to intercede for Sodom, he says, if there are 10 righteous. And I think he thought out of the household of Lot, there would be 10 righteous. That Lot's household was like his household. And basically Sodom had a very bad influence on Lot's family, and same thing with Noah. You see right after the flood and right after Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed, you see the children of Lot, the children and the child of Noah both committing things that would have not been allowed under the law of Moses. And so I think that is part of it. One of the things Christ says, will faith be found when Christ returns, and then you also have that. So to me, you have, you can say Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, but you can also say Lot was saved, by the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and same thing with Noah's family. And you have that same thing with the children of Israel, where Jeremiah talks about good figs and the bad figs, that basically the good figs were the remnant that was taken off to Babylon, and they were saved from what happened to the bad pigs. So that there is that influence that that the world has on us as well, and it's not hard to take us down a bad path, I guess is the way to put it.
Just reading these verses at face value, it says, on that day, It's not like a buildup to that day when the Son of Man is revealed. It's that day. Well, I don't picture myself if an angel knocks on the door, I don't picture myself saying, wait, let me get my wallet and my phone where, all my cash resides on those two things, I better take those with me to the judgment seat in case I need some money. So I wonder, just in practical terms, how do we interpret this?
So you're talking about the section where it talks about those in the housetop should not go down. Is that what you're asking about, those passages?
Right.
I think that's a good question. I honestly struggle with those a little bit because if it's talking about, like you said, we expect the angels to come and gather the elect. Why do we need an exhortation not to go back into our homes? I think Walter has a thought on it, but yeah. And again, I guess we'll.
I may be totally off base, but this references a literal event. In AD 70, it references and alludes to it to tell you when you're in a housetop and they come to blow the city up, get out, don't worry about your purse and everything else, because if you do, you're going to die. So it's the first fulfillment, I think, was in that.
Yeah, because again, and maybe there's sort of a dual application here. Maybe it's because again, like we talked about the Olivet prophecy, there's two things going on. There's what we call AD 70, and then there's the return. So I don't know if it's sort of mixing those two events, the return of Jesus, but also an exhortation of that generation. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, and it's a longer conversation because there was actually, like, they surrounded Jerusalem, right? And then there was a break in that surrounding. And they had to go back to Rome because there was a political, it was Titus, who was the general that was there, and then the Roman emperor died, right? Am I getting this right? And he had to leave for a while, and he had to go and fight and take the throne of, become the emperor, and then he comes back. That's when it was actually destroyed. So what happened was, when the Romans left, a lot of people looked at that as God just saved us, So I think that's a lot. Again, this is all in Josephus's histories, but that's kind of, I think, what Jesus is saying. Like, look, when you get a chance to get out of the city, get out of there. This isn't, God's not saving you; He's giving you a window to leave. So again, I think those. My thinking is that he's sort of talking about two events at once. He's talking about His return and that generation, but that's just mine.
I'm probably getting ahead of you, but were you going to go into Ezekiel where it says the sin of Sodom was pride, fullness of bread, neglecting the poor, and things of that nature?
Yeah, we were gonna. and we can look at that. That's a good place because that's one of the questions we want to answer is what was going on that was so bad in the days of Lot and Sodom, and if you're referring to Ezekiel chapter 16, and we can turn there right now. Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 49 to 50, and we can finish off by reading that, I guess. Ezekiel chapter 16, and then it's verses 49 and 50.
Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had arrogance, abundant food, and careless ease, but she did not help the poor and needy. Thus they were haughty and committed abominations before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it.
So I think that's the passage you're referring to, right, Randy, where it kind of gives a little bit of detail what was going on in that day. It talks about pride and fullness and selfishness and greed. And, we sometimes, it was a very immoral city, right? The angels came there and the people wanted to rape them, basically. It was pretty disturbing. And we find out there was kind of a bigger picture of items going on. It wasn't just morality. But so God willing, we'll pick up on, we'll kind of finish off looking at some more of these illustrations where Jesus teaches us to be ready for His coming. Thank you, everyone, for your comments.